Thanks for the introduction, Olaf. Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here in Doha. Thanks for the invitation, Olivier and everyone else. It's been really good so far, the conference. So today my presentation is going to be the way we use altitude at the Australian Institute of Sport with athletics and swimming predominantly in preparation for the London Olympics. So I'm going to go through some of the research studies we did with the different sports and how this sort of affected the way we use altitude in the final preparation for the Olympics. So probably the main group we did a lot of research with was the race walkers, which has been quite a successful event for Australia over the last two Olympiads. We've won 3 medals with one athlete. And altitude training has been one of our key features in their preparation. So we use multiple altitude exposures during a 4-year cycle using different forms of altitude. So natural altitude at different levels, live high, train low, live high, train low with sleeping higher. Live high, train high with sleeping higher using altitude tents. And we were trying to formulate the best method they could use going into the Olympics. So as been discussed previously, the dominant paradigm for altitude increase in performance is the accelerated erythropoiesis, which increases red blood cells and VO2 max. And this is a multi-factor cascade induced predominantly by the HIF, preventing the degradation of HIF, which allows those proteins to be upregulated. So this can increase angiogenesis, glucose transport, glycolysis, pH regulation. Each of in its own way can improve performance. So we've seen previously, and other groups have seen improved muscle efficiency, probably at a mitochondrial level, which increases performance, and also greater muscle buffering capacity, which can improve the ability to tolerate lactic acid. So given the intensity, so this is sort of why live high, train low was sort of implemented into the regime. Given the intensity of endurance training is reduced at altitude, a modified approach was for athletes to live high but train at the normal altitude, so training wasn't affected. Because the geography of a lot of countries, including Australia, doesn't allow you to go to a high enough altitude, simulated altitude chambers and tents were developed to try and simulate high altitude with allowing athletes to train at the normal altitude. So we've had a couple of iterations of our altitude house chamber. So we started off with a liquid nitrogen tank, which put gaseous nitrogen into a mixture so we could reduce the amount of oxygen in the air. So this simulated different altitudes. And a lot of our earlier research, which has also been referred to previously, used about 8 to 10 hours a day of altitude exposure, so below the 12 to 14 that's now recommended. And we consistently saw 1 to 1.5% increases in performance, but with no real change in red blood cells or VO2 max. We did see some improvements in exercise economy in a couple of studies, so the 2001 and 2004 studies listed there. And we also saw some improvements in buffering capacity. So we were sort of going on that non-hematological changes from altitude exposure, being the main result from live high, train low research. Subsequently, we built a new altitude chamber which had 5 bedrooms, bathroom, kitchen. So we tried to promote longer time in the altitude house. Our first study, which was done by Clark in 2009, was actually in the old altitude house where they spent 14 hours a day in a very confined space. But yeah, so our idea was to try and get more time in the altitude house and see whether that increases hemoglobin mass. The study 2010, well, I think I'll go back. Yeah, so, and we saw that this protocol had 3 to 6% increase in hemoglobin mass, and that was regardless of the type of sport. So we saw it in swimmers, we saw it in race walkers, cyclists, runners, and it was a pretty uniform mean increase. So as Chris presented earlier, some people didn't respond, some responded very highly, but the mean response was pretty consistent using this protocol. So every time we did a study with elite athletes, we saw a 3 to 6% increase in performance, and a co-contribution increase in VO2 max of about 2 to 5%. Performance changes also went up 2 to 4%. Some of these were actual performance, some of them were lab-based time trials or track time trials for runners or walkers. So we used these findings to do our first study with the race walkers in 2008, and this was in preparation for the Beijing Olympics. So before the selection trials, we had 17 international standard walkers came to the RAS, and we divided them into 3 groups. So we had 2 groups stayed in the altitude house. One were at 3,000 metres, one were at normal altitude of Canberra, which is 600 metres. We tried to blind it with the subjects, but our blinding wasn't great, so we pretty much had 2 control groups. And we had 1 group in Canberra who weren't in the altitude house, so they were just at 600 metres. So everyone trained together for the 3-week period. And the group in the altitude house spent 14 hours per day for the 3 weeks. So that's a picture of our new facilities. So we've got our lab, which is based here, just in that corner. And then on the first level, we've got the altitude house, which is a 5-bedroom, kitchen, 2-bathroom facility. Each room's individually operated, so we can have them all set, something similar to the facilities here. And 3,000 metres is the altitude we set the rooms at for the intervention group. So our study design, so before we did the study, we did a double baseline haemoglobin mass test. We did a performance test, VO2 max, walk-in economy on the treadmill. So that was 4 submaximal workloads, followed by 10-minute all-out tests at 4% gradient, where they were tried to achieve their best possible distance, so they could adjust the speed up or down every 30 seconds. We also did their best 20K performance in the 6 months leading into their study as their pre-test, and then we had 2 races straight afterwards and 4 weeks afterwards, which is the selection trials for the national championships. We did weekly haemoglobin mass measures, so we wanted to see the time course of the haemoglobin mass response in the 2 groups, and we also did weekly blood measures. Treadmill test was done post to have a look at the effect on VO2 max, economy, and laboratory performance. So here's the results of the study. So our top left graph is the haemoglobin mass results from the 2 groups. So on the y-axis, we've got haemoglobin mass in grams, and on the x-axis, we've got time in weeks. So the pre-test, we've got the green group is the placebo, the yellow group is the nocebo, and the red group is the live high, train low group. And we saw no change in haemoglobin mass at any time point in the 2 control groups, but we pretty much saw about a 1% improvement every week in the live high, train low group, culminating at about a 4 to 5% improvement at 3 weeks. And then they still maintained the improvement a week later, but it started to drop a little bit. VO2 max is below that, and we can see in the black lines we've got all the control trials for VO2 max, and the open bars are the post-test. So we've got altitude, placebo, nocebo, and we can see about a 5% improvement in VO2 max in the altitude group, about a 2.5% increase in the placebo group, and no change in the nocebo group. But I suppose the interesting part of the study is, although we saw these hematological effects in the altitude only, all groups improved 10-minute treadmill performance by about 4%. So you can see in that graph there, each of the open bars is about 4% higher than the pre-test. So that's straight away after exposure, and it's a 10-minute performance test, which is a bit shorter than their race distance, but still a good training camp we've got by getting a good group of athletes together. Chris mentioned earlier, we did do the race performances, but we had a lot of dropouts who didn't do the races for various reasons, but 4 out of the 6 athletes in the Live High Train group had all-time best performances at that trials. All those 4s made the Olympic team, and one of the athletes won 2 medals at the Olympics. So anecdotally, we had a really good effect from the altitude training, and this formed the basis for their preparation for London. So 21 days on Live High, Train Low, 14 hours a day, 7 days no altitude, and then another 2 weeks of Live High, Train Low. Finishing 3 days out, and then departed to the Beijing, and then 3 weeks was their first competition. Usually the 50Ks first and the 20 for the guys. And very good race results by all athletes on the team. So classic altitude training is the other one we've played around with a lot. So this is athletes going up and living on a mountain. And we've seen world-class performances, subsequent altitude training across the board. And the comment was made before, 90% of elite athletes will use altitude training. So it's very popular. The coaches think it works, the athletes think it works, and people are doing it all the time. So race walkers are no different. So the meta-analysis that Chris referred to previously shows about a 1.9% improvement in sea level performance from uncontrolled study and about a 1.6 improvement in controlled studies. The training camp is a huge factor. People who go up a mountain know they're at altitude, and most of them believe the altitude training works. So that is one factor. And there may be a reduction in absolute training intensity, which can be accommodated by adjusting rest recoveries and the distance of intervals. So it can be accommodated quite well. So some of the work that has been done with live, high, train, low studies at AIS. So Chris mentioned that study done in Toluca. Didn't really see any changes in hemoglobin mass or VO2 max, but performance was better. Laura also presented some stuff from Stelvio, which is about 2,700 metres, 3 weeks in cyclists, 4% increase in hemoglobin mass. A study that Chris also mentioned, which we used Sierra Nevada, Spain, and Flagstaff in Arizona, which are both in the low 2000s. We had a 5% increase in hemoglobin mass. I'll go through some of the performance results later on. And some of the work I did with some middle distance runners at 1,800 metres saw about a 2% improvement in performance over a competitive racing season. So trying to make sure athletes aren't injured, aren't sick, aren't overtrained, and are iron replete are key factors we found in maximising altitude training camps, and that's one area we really drum home to the coaches and athletes. And varying adaptations can occur. So sometimes they might increase hemoglobin mass, VO2 max, other times economy, and it doesn't seem to be the same response every time. All right, so this study was conducted in 2011 in the race walks, and we wanted to compare live high, train low versus low altitude training in preparation for competition at low altitude. So this is a World Cup race they have every year in Mexico, 1,400 metres. We had 28 elite race walkers. One group went at a similar altitude to the competition, so Thredbo, Australia, which is 1,350 metres, and we had 2 weeks, so sort of the minimum acclimatisation period for good performance at altitude. And then we wanted to have a look at the live high, train low. So just staying in the altitude house, is that going to give you a good preparation for competition on low altitude? And the third group just stayed in Canberra and did all their training. So the testing was all done in Thredbo, 1,350 metres, and we did a VO2 max and performance test. Performance test was, we had two. We had a laboratory performance, which is a time to exhaustion test in the VO2 max. And we also did a 5x2K walk at 1,350, which is a pretty standard test that they do in their training period. Hemoglobin mass was done pre-post in Canberra. This is a summary of the results. So we've got the classic altitude group, so the Thredbo group, the live high, train low group, and the control group. Hemoglobin mass was interestingly increased by 4.2% at quite a low altitude, but the control group also improved by 2.8%. So the actual difference between the control and the classic was probably not there, but they were getting some effects, and maybe that's the phase of the training they were in. Similar in VO2 max, 5.3% compared to 3.4%. Economy, not much different apart from the live high, train low, which is about a 3%, which is a worthwhile improvement. The 10K performance, so 5x2K at Thredbo, was best in the group who acclimatised at the altitude, so 3.6% compared to not much change in the other. And then time to exhaustion, the treadmill was a lot better in the two altitude groups compared to the control group. So we were getting some good acclimatisation benefits in particularly the group who were at the altitude they're going to be competing at. So the next line of study we wanted to look at in the race walk was using altitude tents at Thredbo, so basically trying to stimulate further the hematological effects and some of the other effects of live high, train low, while still getting the training adaptations at 1,350 metres. So we had three-week period of classic low altitude, so we had two groups. One group just lived and trained in Thredbo, one group lived at Thredbo and slept 9 to 10 hours a night at 3,000 metres. 18 walkers. The testing was all done in Canberra. We wanted to have a look at this effect of sea level performance. So we did VO2 max and hemoglobin mass and normoxia. So summary of the results. The Thredbo group in the first column, the Thredbo group plus sleeping at 3,000 metres in the second column. and we can see a 3% improvement in the group using the tent. So in this study, we haven't seen the increase in hemoglobin mass that we saw before at Threadbow, but we did, with the introduction of the tents, increase hemoglobin mass. VO2 max, about 4% increase in both groups, not much in economy, and time to exhaustion was also increased in both groups. So we're getting a good training effect from both of these altitude training groups. The next study we did, which was also done in 2011, was trying to combine. So one of the things in race walking, which we do a lot of, is trying to heat acclimate them. So most of the major competitions are performed in hot, humid conditions, and the walkers over 20, 50 Ks really do struggle if they haven't got good heat acclimation, especially when we're preparing in usually the southern hemisphere where it's winter going into summer. So one of our protocols in preparation for Beijing was to set up a real systematic heat acclimation protocol to maximise performance. Different adaptations from heat and altitude, the increase in plasma volume and maybe economy you get from heat, the increased hemoglobin mass and VO2 max you can get from altitude. So we want to try and combine those two mechanisms into a training. So we had, for this study, 5 athletes who went to St. Moritz in preparation for the 2011 World Championships, and we turned a garage where they were staying into a heat room. So we put a bunch of heaters in there, a couple of treadmills, and we maintained it pretty well at 32 degrees, 60% humidity. So by sort of a bit of opening and closing the doors, water baths, heaters, we were pretty happy with the temperatures we were getting. So this was a crossover design. So we have all athletes do no intervention pre-post testing of VO2 max, hemoglobin mass, and performance, and that was done in both thermoneutral conditions in the laboratory, 20 degrees, and in the heat. So we tested them all in both of those situations, and then they did the intervention. So there was, they can compare the results to their own control. So if we have a look at the results, the combined altitude heat resulted in a 5% increase in hemoglobin mass, 5.4% increase in VO2 max, economy, no change in either group. Plasma volume up a little bit in the control group, and that drop of 2.3% is actually pretty good. With no heat acclimation, we usually see up to a 10% drop in plasma volume with altitude due to the hemo concentration. So we've attenuated that a little bit with the heat. And 10-minute performance in thermoneutral was 3% better. Was 2% better in the heat, but you can see they deacclimated when they had no heat. So basically got 3% worse. So the difference between the two groups was quite big. So the introduction of the altitude and heat improved performance in the heat compared to no acclimation. So this is how we prepared for London in the race walkers. So 2011, 2 weeks in Threadbow, 3 weeks in the altitude house, 3 weeks at St. Moritz with the addition of heat acclimation, and we also did a 8-week specific heat acclimation period of no altitude. 2012, similar protocol, so 3 weeks in Threadbow with or without the tents, 3 weeks of live high, train low in our altitude house, 8 weeks of our specific heat acclimation, so 2 sessions of an hour per week, and another 3 weeks in St. Moritz with the addition of live high, train low for our top athlete, Jared Talent, who used that right into the games. All right, so I'll go on to some of the work we did with swimming. So Chris touched on this study that we did comparing the effects of natural altitude with live high, train low. So we had a 3-week training camp, 26 national, 21 national level swimmers preparing for the World Championships in 2009. So we had 5 swimmers who went to Sierra Nevada, Spain, 12 who went to Flagstaff, and 9 who stayed in Canberra and slept in the altitude house. So key variables were hemoglobin mass, which we measured pre-day 1 and 2 weeks after the altitude interventions, and we're looking for greater than 2% changes to be worthwhile. Race performance was the other one, so we really want to look at the effect on race performance and the timing of the effects. So we measured them before they went to altitude, day 1, week 1, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and in a subgroup who made world champs 7 weeks, which was the period world champs was on. So if we have a look at hemoglobin mass, so the grayed out areas are sort of worthwhile change, nothing in the control group. The altitude groups have both increased by about 4% immediately after. If anything, the natural altitude groups maintain that change a little bit better 2 weeks after, but both are still elevated 2 weeks after exposure. So race performance, you can see the pre-test is just 0, so everything's relative to their pre. And then we've got our day 1, week 1, week 2, week 4. And the red is the live high, train low. The blue is natural altitude. So what we can see is our worthwhile change of 0.5% or 0.3%. So we can see here in the live high, train low group, a week after competition, they're a lot worse than pre, whereas the live high, train low are about the same. So day after, they're both no good really. So straight off the mountain, the performance is about 0.6% worse. And then you can see, as I previously mentioned, the live high, train low group struggled more. So performance is better 2 weeks and 4 weeks, but not really better than the pre-test. So we're sort of within that sort of variability of no improvement in performance. We did measure furtherly the effect on performance of the World Championships, and this was the era of the super suits. So basically everyone improved out of sight. We compared them to a match control who weren't in the study but did the trials, which was a pre-test that we used, and basically the groups were not different. Both groups improved to the same extent. So we sort of concluded that the altitude intervention, although they improved hemoglobin mass, weren't really having the same effect on performance. So the major findings were don't plan a camp 1 to 2 weeks before a major competition. Both forms of altitude increase the same improvements in hemoglobin mass. Attention to all elements of the preparation, because altitude benefits won't override other failings in training, so make sure that you keep working on technique, especially in swimming, because there's some big gains or losses that can be made there. So in follow-up to this study particularly, one of the coaches got quite interested in altitude training. So this graph is some serial exposure we did with 4 swimmers, and it was a combination of natural altitude in Sierra Nevada, so 3 different camps of Sierra Nevada and 3 different live high, train low camps of 3,000 meters, 14 hours a day. So basically you can see the data points. So we've got a pre and post for each of those camps, and I've done a regression line for the changes over the period. You can see pretty much a 10% improvement of hemoglobin mass over the 3-year period in all athletes. So this was quite a good finding for us, that using altitude serially over a 4-year period can have big increases in hemoglobin mass in elite swimmers. But the next work we did, we wanted to try and find whether live high, train low was beneficial for 400-meter runners, quite an anaerobic capacity event. So we wanted to compare live high, train low, and then the next study was we used some distance runners that we wanted to compare, similar to the swimmers, the difference between live high, train low and live high, train high. So the first study with the 400-meter runners, we had a 3-week intervention, 3,000 meters, 14 hours a day, same protocol as all our other research. We did a treadmill test, which measured aerobic and anaerobic capacity, so a MAOD test. We also did blood and hemoglobin mass, and we did a track test, which was a two sets of 2 by 200 meter tests with 1 minute between the first 200s and then 15 minutes between the sets. So basically they did a 200 meters, had a 1 minute recovery, another 200, full recovery, and they did it again. We did blood measures 3 minutes after the first set, and then 3, 6 and 9 to get the peak pH, lactate and bicarbonate difference between the session. So the treadmill test, 4 by 4 minutes sub-maximal to work out the aerobic contribution and the predicted VO2 max running at 24 k's an hour or 21 for females. And then we basically ran them at those speeds until exhaustion, and we measured oxygen consumption. From that we can work out the aerobic and anaerobic contribution to that test. So hemoglobin mass improved in all subjects above the worthwhile change, so from 2% up to 9%, so quite a range. Mean was 5.1%, so pretty much the same as all of our other research, about a 4 to 5% increase in hemoglobin mass as a group. Heart rate and lactate during the sub-maximal stages were clearly lower after the altitude period, indicating better running economy. VO2 max was variable, but generally no change, although the oxygen carrier capacity should be better with the increased hemoglobin mass. MEOD was increased by 4% in all groups, slightly greater anaerobic contribution, and lower lactates in the effort despite similar work. We had a greater pH disturbance, and this is probably due to the greater amount of work to be done, so they pushed through the system a little bit more. And the mean performance time in the maximal test improved by 4.6%. So this was at pretty much 60-second lap pace for the males as long as they could go. So they improved by about 5 seconds in that test, 3%. So in the track test, we saw about a 3.5 and a 1.6% improvement in the first set of 200s, and in the second set there was a 1.9, but then a 3% slower in the second. So overall, we had about a 1% improvement in performance in 800 time when you add all the times together, and this was mainly achieved in the first 400 of the 800. Similar pH disturbance and bicarb decrease after the efforts, and higher lactate values indicating they had more flux through the glycolytic system. So in summary, we had an increased erythropoietic response, improved cardiovascular economy by the lower heart rates and lactates, and improved buffer capacity. So they had a better ability to tolerate lactic acid, and each of these should serve for better performance in the 400-metre event. So the final part of the research I'm going to present is a study we did in 2011 with elite distance runners. So we took one group to Prepararation, Australia, which is about 1,800 metres where we stayed, and the training was done predominantly at 1,700 metres to 2,000, although we did a few sessions down at 1,000 metres. And the second group did the lift high, train low protocol, which I've mentioned previously. So we had 4 athletes in that group, 8 athletes in the Prepararation group, and we had 8 athletes in the control group who just lived in Canberra. Did double baseline hemoglobin mass, and we measured them at 2 and 3 weeks. We can see about a 3% improvement after 2 weeks in the live high, train low at low altitude, and about a 4% increase after 3 weeks. In the live high, train low group, we've seen about a 5 and up to 7%. And this is in some of the best distance runners in Australia. So we had a couple of Australian record holders in this group. So they're starting at 17, some of them were 17 grams per kilogram hemoglobin mass, and we still got these big changes. So that's sort of a test that you can get changes in hemoglobin mass in already high level athletes. Control group didn't change. So how some of these results can be applied to the team sports setting. So there's a strong aerobic fitness required. So it's been mentioned about sort of 11 to 13 kilometres per game in sort of AFL and soccer. The anaerobic energy systems involving PCR and glycolytic pathways also highly important. We've seen changes from these interventions in both of those areas. And the demands of team sports lend themselves towards potential gains from altitude. So for each individual athlete, we should be able to increase their physiological capacities, which allow them to better carry out the game. The best time to perform's unclear in an individual athlete, let alone a team environment where other factors such as decision making and skills are important. But a couple of opportunities are in the pre-season. So a lot of clubs are going over to the US in the AFL to get a good block of altitude training to set themselves up for the season. And maybe mid-season, getting a second block or using live high, train low sort of during the season. Some of the intermittent work is also quite encouraging, and I know a lot of clubs are already using this. So key considerations we found from a lot of this research is good fitness base is critical, making sure that they're in a good period of training, not flat or overtrained, and definitely not sick or injured. Iron's critical, so we always blood test and iron supplement our athletes unless they're severely high ferritin, and maintaining body mass and hydration. So basically altitude's an extra stress. If you're trying to lose weight or you're not staying on your hydration, basically you're going to be in a catabolic state, and the adaptations are a lot harder. So that's factors we really try to drum home to our athletes. Thank you.